Of course, you know that what we're here for and why we're here. It's because of this latest quarterly essay, What's Right? The Future of Conservatism in Australia by Waleed Aly, who, as you know, is a lecturer in politics at Monash University and a well-known media performer, which I must talk to him about later because he's cramping a little bit of my space in the media. Of course, you would also know about Waleed. He's paid a very heavy price for some of his beliefs. Quite a fair bit of criticism he faces, and of course I'm talking about his support of the Richmond Football Club. But we all have our drawbacks, don't we? But this is a terrific piece, I would say, as someone who sort of skirts around politics and the ideas that go around politics. So congratulations, Waleed. It really is terrific, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about it.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should deal with a little bit of the terminology and the ideas underlying that terminology that you use throughout the essay. Maybe you want to just take us through some of those, please.
Sure, okay. Because that's what everyone here wants, is a lecture on terminology. Well, it's about conservatism. Maybe that's a good place to start.
Indeed.
Actually, no. I'm going to start the way I start the essay by talking about why I wrote it. That's probably the easiest way into it. I think it was 2007 or somewhere around there, I read an essay or an article in Quadrant, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's probably the highest profile conservative publication in Australia. It's the publication that John Howard himself endorses, and he spoke at their 50th anniversary, and it was, and in that article, it was written by a couple of people, one of whom is Tom Switzer, who at the time was the opinion editor at The Australian. And it was an interesting piece because it was arguing that the Iraq War was a deeply unconservative war, which is news to a lot of people, I think, given that it was launched by conservatives, the conservative side of politics in America. It was supported overwhelmingly, I think almost to a person in Australia on the conservative side of politics and on political discourse. And if you opposed it, you were likely not to be on the conservative side of politics. They pointed out, though, that in the UK, conservatives were more likely to be against the war than Labor voters. But their argument was an interesting one, which was that it was an unconservative war because the idea that lay at its heart was that a tyrant had to be removed in order to establish democracy and freedom. And that this was a quintessentially unconservative approach to foreign affairs and to politics, because conservatives didn't do things like regime change for the purposes of establishing a new political order. That's not the work of conservatism, that's the work of revolutionaries, that's the work of humanitarian interventionists and so on. So that when Tony Blair went into Iraq, that was perfectly consistent for him to do that. In fact, he did the same thing in Bosnia on a humanitarian intervention basis in the Balkans, where John Major, his conservative predecessor, refused on the grounds that this isn't our fight, it's nothing to do with us.
Indeed.
And it got me thinking, because that was my view of the war, was that I opposed the war. And one of the reasons I opposed the war was that the idea of forcefully implementing a new political system and being surprised when there were horrific consequences of trying to do this, this was just complete folly. And that it was not a very conservative idea. Conservatism really resonated with being pragmatic and understanding the limitations on things and not trying to create a perfect world or trying to remake the world at all. That's not what conservatives are about. And so I began thinking through this a little more and thinking that, well, when I think about what conservatism is as a philosophical tradition, as an intellectual tradition, I find myself reading conservative political philosophy and agreeing with a lot of it. And then I find myself on the opposite side of just about every issue to people who call themselves conservatives. Why? What's going on? Are there no more conservatives? Have I just got it completely wrong? But it awoke in me the desire to explore more fully what conservatism actually meant in a philosophical way, and then consider the way we use it. When we use the term conservative, in our public discourse, what we usually mean is someone who believes ardently in the free market and that government should not interfere with the market basically at all, and if they have to the minimal extent. And then we talk about social conservatism, which is essentially a set of ideas about what people should believe. And now those two things happen to be contradictory, and that's something I explain in the essay, and we might get there eventually. But actually, neither of those things is conservative in the philosophical sense. Rather, what conservatism is, and to find, it's actually hard to do this. You could pick up a book which collates sort of the great thinkers in the British conservative tradition. I mean, the Russian conservative tradition is something different, but in British conservative tradition, you can pick up the great thinkers from Burke and Halifax through to Disraeli and Winston Churchill and so on. And really what you get out of that is that conservatism is not an ideology. So it's not pro-market or anti-market or anything like that. Conservatism is what Michael Oakeshott, who's a conservative political philosopher, called a disposition. So let me give you an example that perhaps is not terribly relevant, but I'm going to do it anyway.
We've got a fair bit of time,
yeah.
So don't worry.
When I was growing up, you've mentioned Richmond, so let's talk about footy. When I was growing up, I was hugely into footy. I still am, despite all the pain. And
makes you a better person.
It does. I have character. This is something that supporters of other clubs don't understand. And I loved the VFL. When the AFL was introduced, I was livid. I didn't want to see my team play Fremantle. That meant nothing to me. I didn't want to see my team play anyone in Perth, really. That's a long way away. And I'm probably not going. What I wanted was what I felt the VFL was, this institution that had been built up over time and become so ingrained in our social fabric that it was part of us. And here we were, essentially corporatising it, turning it into a national competition. That is a conservative response.
Is another part of the conservative response that you actually eventually have embraced the AFL?
And that's a very good question. So the point about conservatism then is it's not about whether or not I like the VFL. It's about my approach to change. And conservatism is about a belief that society is organic, that it evolves slowly, that it should evolve slowly, and that sudden disruptive change is a bad idea, that evolution is better than revolution. And of course the roots of conservatism lie in the French Revolution and opposition to it. But the question you ask is a good one. What happens when change happens? And here I would say again, the conservative is not a nostalgic. I am a little nostalgic, leave that aside. But the conservative does not seek to resurrect an old order. The conservative is a fantastic quote which I use in the book from Quinton Hogg, I think it is, who was one of Churchill's ministers, who said that the role of the conservative is really to oppose the latest heresy on the basis that they support the current order of things. And then, once that heresy becomes part of the order of things, to defend that heresy against the next one.
Exactly.
That is that the Conservative is not trying to resurrect the past. They celebrate the present, particularly those aspects of the present that have served us well, that have evolved over time. But when the change happens, and it is upon us, they don't seek to wind back the clock. They're concerned only that the change that occurs in society is not unduly disruptive. And so, yes, if I wanted to go back to the VFL now, that would not be a conservative course of action. That would be a reactionary, nostalgic course of action. It would have been conservative in 1987 when the West Coast Eagles and the Brisbane Bears, I still laugh when I say that, when they joined the competition, that was a conservative thing to do. But the Conservative now would go, well, I mean, it's kind of happened now. What we need to do is manage that as best we can, cushion the blow, cushion the impact of the change, but make sure that society retains its organic integrity. A really good example of that is the way that conservatism responded to democracy. Just about no conservative in the world is going to stand up now and say they're anti-democracy. Well, not in the democratic world anyway. Conservatives had a really hard time with democracy when it was first floated.
It took a very, very long time to take hold in tiny little stages.
Exactly. There's a radical idea. You give the working classes the vote? This is crazy. I mean, these people don't have an education. They're not concerned with things like liberty and governance, and these. I mean, what you have is a governing class for that. People who have the appropriate education and experience. If you hand over the reins of power, or input into the levers of power, if you hand that over to the uneducated, you're going to get a government that doesn't do things like protect people's liberty. That was the Conservative argument. But ultimately, it was Benjamin Disraeli, a conservative British Prime Minister, who introduced the working class franchise in Great Britain because the change was going to come. And Conservatives recognised, well, this is coming. What we need to do is usher it in a way that's not disruptive. That's what conservatism is. It's not about things like the free market. In fact, a lot of conservatives didn't like the Industrial Revolution. It's too revolutionary.
But let's sort of, because I'm going to keep going with this terminology question until you answer it.
Do.
So,
I thought that was an answer.
Yeah, it was good.
Of sorts.
Good. It wasn't, what you're really putting forward here is that the type of political conservatism as it's expressed domestically, say, let's just talk about it that way, in terms of the last federal government, for example, wasn't the type of classical conservatism you're talking about here. You're talking about a new conservatism, a new liberalism, sort of that sort of merge around each other. Would you like to sort of speak to that? In fact,
I think I'd probably go further and say that I think that classical conservatism is largely dead, but especially on the conservative side of politics. And the reason I say that is because we now live in a world where the conservative has become conflated with things like pro-free market. And that has really happened since 1979, when Margaret Thatcher was elected in Britain, when Ronald Reagan the following year was elected in the United States, and then finally here when John Howard was elected in 1996. But even before that, when the Labor Party accepted the thrust of those reforms. And the coalition supported that. And what happened there was that essentially conservative political parties they embraced the idea of neoliberalism. Now, this is an idea that we hear about a little bit now. We didn't before Kevin Rudd wrote a thing about it. Now we hear a bit about it, but we don't really know about what it is.
Unfortunately, everybody read that on the tram on the way here.
I'm sure they did. It was prescribed reading, and I would expect most people to have done their homework. But what I mean by neoliberalism is not just a belief that free markets are good. Lots of people believe that. A liberal believes that. But a belief that the market is such a compelling philosophical idea that it should be the philosophical reference point for politics. That ultimately things don't have meaning outside, or certainly not meaning that isn't arbitrary, outside a market mechanism. Now, things flow from that. If I say the gap between rich and poor is widening, that's unjust, The neoliberal will respond by saying, well, there's nothing unjust about that. That's just the market at work. If you believe that's unjust, that's a political decision that you're making, which is an arbitrary decision that is interfering with the way that the market operates. And that's a form of tyranny. Neoliberalism begins as a theory of liberty. It begins as a theory of perfect freedom. The man often credited with founding it, or being the main philosophical driver of it, Friedrich Hayek, himself was someone, he wrote, his classic work is called The Road to Serfdom. It's not how to boost your productivity. It's the road to serfdom. That is, his argument was that government interference in the economy, and basically in a lot of life, was opening up the door to mass social slavery, essentially, to a return to socialism and through it Nazism. Now, he wasn't joking. He was from Austria. He'd left Austria in the interwar period. He'd seen Austria through a socialist path move ultimately to Nazism. So I'm not writing off his concerns. But it was a theory of radical liberty. And in time, he wasn't that popular at the time he wrote that, but in time that became the orthodoxy. And in the 70s and 80s...
Which leads to Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society.
Right.
Society, there are individual actors operating in a market.
There is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. Now, in truth, she said a bit more than that. Yeah. But it is nonetheless true that in a neoliberal world, society really only is constituted of individuals going about their own individual aims. It's not held together by some overarching understanding of what society should be aiming at or what is good for society or some shared understanding of values or culture. It's not defined by that. The way Hayek put it was to say that the great society is held together really only by activity that is economic. He didn't mean economic in the financial sense, but economic in the sense of people pursuing their own individual aims, not serving this thing, this abstract thing called society.
So you saw, this is one of the reasons, of course, we saw neoliberals arguing against stimulus package bailouts because, clearly it didn't fit the idea of, necessary corrections during the global financial crisis.
In fact, if you watch the US debate, it's fascinating how quickly those things become socialism.
Indeed.
The government wants to do anything, they're communists.
Yes.
There's a reason the debate goes that way, and it's because it proceeds on neoliberal grounds, which is actually what neoliberalism was worried about, that you return to communism and forms of fascism through government involvement in things like the market.
So what's your diagnosis of the state of neoliberalism in the wake of the global financial crisis?
That's a really good question. I think neoliberalism is... remember, this was the dominant political ideology of the last 30 years. And we need to be careful here because neoliberalism in theory is different to neoliberalism in practice. There are things about the financial crisis that occurred not through pure neoliberalism, but actually impure applications of it. An example is neoliberals were very concerned to avoid concentrations of power. That meant they didn't like the idea of mega corporations. Now, clearly we have that. And clearly that was a problem. You have the too big to fail problem, where entities get so big that governments have to bail them out. A neoliberal would say that was not an application of neoliberalism. Nonetheless, the guiding ideological framework, the philosophical understanding that neoliberalism is ultimately... that the market is ultimately our philosophy now. It's not just a phenomenon, it's a philosophy. That, I think, is something that's coming under attack, partly because of the financial crisis. The fact that we've been pursuing this kind of approach and things aren't going so well, or it didn't go so well. And even though in Australia we say, what financial crisis? That you're not saying that in the US and you're not saying that in Europe, or even in Asia. So that it's under attack from that perspective. But I also think another real challenge that's emerged from it, and here it depends on how seriously you take this challenge, is climate change. Because one of the things that climate change did, or does, is challenge the idea that the market is a sufficient philosophical guide. Climate change, or the concept generally of environmental degradation, is something that it's basically a negative consequence of market operations. So the minute you say, well, this is a problem, you imply that the market is not a sufficient philosophical ideology and that you need something else. It may be a useful institution, but you need politics to intervene. You need political stops on the operation of the market to stop certain things happening, like environmental degradation or like the kind of collapses that we've seen through the financial crisis. Now, my point in the essay about the relationship of this to conservatism is that this understanding of society as essentially a market society and the social changes that that implies is actually deeply unconservative. And so to illustrate this in the simplest way I can think, let's take, this is an example I often use. Was work choices conservative? Well, it was conservative in the way that we talk about it. Conservatives put it forward. It was very conservative. It was very pro-market. So on. I actually think it was, in the philosophical sense, deeply unconservative. Here it was changing quite radically the nature of the relationship between employer and employee.
So it's because it was one big hit? Is that why you think?
Partly, yeah. It was one big hit that struck at institutions. I mean, trade unions are institutions that conservatives should and in the past have valued. We don't think of that because Margaret Thatcher didn't like trade unions. Was Margaret Thatcher being conservative when she introduced quite radical legislation to remove power from trade unions? No, that was a radical act. So my argument is to say that the idea of neoliberalism is not only not the same as conservatism, but is actually, in many important respects, quite different, the opposite, in fact. And it is because these two things have become conflated that on the conservative side of politics you have fewer and fewer people who, at least in a classical sense, I would regard or describe as conservatives. I mean, does a conservative really believe that it's a good thing to deregulate the labour market to such an extent that people cannot maintain regular working hours to spend time with their families? On the battle of family values versus labour market flexibility, where does a conservative stand? When the market produces outcomes like, which is something I talk about in the essay, the hypersexualisation of society and particularly children, and this concept of corporate pedophilia, does the conservative say, well, that's the market operation, we should leave that? Or does the conservative say, hang on, something's happening to our society and our culture?
Well, you made some interesting references to that because, of course, that issue took on quite a deal of publicity a few years ago, courtesy of the Australia Institute, a sort of left-wing think tank. And you go through explaining how the Australian, in its editorial, attacked the suggestion of it, basically.
Yeah.
Really because of where the critique had come from rather than the critique itself, is that?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So when the Australian wrote but I should say I was really interested, a week ago, there was an editorial in the Australian about the sexualisation of children through commercial practice that was saying companies really need to pull in their heads and so on. So that they themselves had shifted their position. But at the time, yes, the Australian wrote an interesting editorial which was arguing that this was just a left-wing radical feminist who doesn't like capitalism attacking capitalism. It seemed odd to me that response, because I would have thought if ever there was a conservative cause staring you in the face demanding that conservatives actually get angry about something, here it is. Our children are being sexualised out of their innocence. Whatever, it's not hard to come up with a slogan. But that wasn't the response. That is, the response, in my view, wasn't conservative. It was neoliberal. That is to say, hands off the market, stop making a mountain out of a molehill. Stop engaging in what they literally said was moral panic. I don't think that was a conservative response. And my argument is that the reason that conservatism has ended up that way is because by embracing neoliberalism so wholly, it's ultimately left itself nowhere to go on issues like that, where you have social consequences that are disruptive, that spell disruptive change. The conservative suddenly finds himself having to defend that change in the interest of their neoliberal commitments. with one exception. And that is in the politics of culture that can sort of be divorced from the market. So at the same time as you've had this backing away from serious thinking about culture in a conservative way and the need to maintain integrity in the cultural space and not disrupt social institutions, at the same time you've had that, you've had a different kind of social conservatism.
You're talking about history wars and things
History
like
wars,
this?
culture wars, migrants have to learn English, citizenship tests. That is now what it gets called conservative social politics. That strikes me as really odd because it doesn't actually say a great deal about society. And having embraced an idea that minimises the concept of society, you now seek to reassert it essentially by bashing up minorities. That to me is not conservative. That's neoconservative, and that's another term I use in the essay. And I mean it in a particular way. I don't mean it in the narrow American sense of the term, as it came out of the US. But what I mean by that is it's a new kind of conservatism that actually brings together the worst of good old-fashioned left-wing politics with the worst of good old-fashioned right-wing politics and brings them together.